Picture this. You're standing in the baking aisle, staring at two bags of sugar sitting side by side on the shelf. One is bright white, almost clinical in its purity. The other is warm and golden brown, with that familiar earthy, almost caramel-like scent drifting through the plastic. And without even thinking about it, your brain has already made a decision. The white one is the processed one, the refined one, the one that food documentaries love to demonize. The brown one is the natural one, the wholesome one, the one your grandmother probably used. So you reach for the brown bag, drop it in your cart, and feel quietly good about yourself. But here is the thing. That quiet confidence might be built on a complete misunderstanding. Because the story of white sugar and brown sugar is not the story of processed versus natural. It is not even the story of two different ingredients with two different journeys. It is, in many ways, the story of the exact same substance, split apart, and then deliberately put back together again. And once you understand what is actually happening inside that bag of brown sugar, you may never look at the baking aisle quite the same way. To understand the difference between these two products, you have to start at the very beginning, long before any factory gets involved. Both white sugar and brown sugar almost always come from the same two plants. Either sugarcane, a tall tropical grass that grows abundantly across South America, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa, or the sugar beet, a root vegetable cultivated heavily across Europe, the United States, and China. The process starts the same way regardless of the plant. Sugarcane stalks are harvested and crushed to extract a raw, murky, greenish juice loaded with sucrose. Sugar beets are sliced and soaked in hot water, which draws out their naturally sweet liquid. In both cases, what you end up with at this early stage is nothing particularly glamorous. It is a warm, syrupy liquid full of water, plant fibers, proteins, and a dense concentration of dissolved sugars. It smells faintly of the earth it came from. From there, the liquid is cleaned, filtered, and then cooked under carefully controlled conditions until the water evaporates and the sucrose begins to crystallize. As those crystals form, they pull away from the surrounding liquid. And the liquid that remains behind, the thick, dark, bittersweet syrup that refuses to crystallize, is called molasses. This is the moment where everything in our story begins to diverge. Because what happens next to that molasses will determine the entire trajectory of modern sugar production, and it will explain the very mystery sitting in your shopping cart. For most of recorded history, highly refined white sugar was not ordinary. It was extraordinary. Ancient civilizations across India, Persia, and China had known about crystallized sugar for well over 2,000 years, but producing it in pure, sparkling white form required enormous effort, specialized knowledge, and expensive infrastructure. The refining process involved multiple rounds of boiling, filtering, and clarifying, often using clay or bone char to strip away impurities and color. By the time refined white sugar reached medieval Europe, it had become one of the most coveted and costly commodities in existence. Historians estimate that in 14th century England, a kilogram of white sugar cost the equivalent of several days of skilled labor wages. Wealthy households kept it under lock and key. Physicians prescribed it as medicine. Kings served it at banquets as a demonstration of their power and prosperity. In the court of Elizabeth I of England, white sugar was consumed in such extraordinary quantities that contemporary accounts noted the Queen's teeth had turned conspicuously black from decay. And rather than hiding this, it was reportedly fashionable among the aristocracy to mimic the look, because blackened teeth signaled that you were rich enough to eat all the sugar you pleased. Meanwhile, the byproduct of this entire refining operation, the molasses, was considered almost worthless. It was used to feed livestock, sold cheaply to distilleries to be fermented into rum, or simply discarded. The hierarchy was clear. White was premium. Brown was what was left over. Here is where the story takes the turn that surprises most people. Today, the sugar industry has become extraordinarily efficient. Modern refineries can strip sugarcane or sugar beet juice down to pure white crystalline sucrose with remarkable speed and consistency. And for a long time, partially refined sugars, those that still contained some residual molasses from the crystallization process, were simply a byproduct of not finishing the job completely. These were known as raw sugars, and products like turbinado and muscovado still work this way, retaining their molasses content naturally by stopping the refining process before completion. But most of the brown sugar you find on supermarket shelves today is not made that way. Most commercial brown sugar is produced by taking fully refined white sugar, white, pure, completely stripped of its molasses, and then adding a precisely measured amount of molasses back into it afterward. Read that again slowly, because it genuinely is as counterintuitive as it sounds. The factory removes the molasses to make white sugar. Then it adds some molasses back to make brown sugar. The reason this became standard practice is actually quite logical from a manufacturing standpoint. When you rely on partial refining to make brown sugar, you get inconsistency. The color varies, the moisture content fluctuates, the flavor shifts from batch to batch depending on the quality of the raw crop that season. By starting with a controlled, uniform white sugar base and adding a precise quantity of molasses, manufacturers can produce a product that looks, tastes, and behaves identically every single time. Light brown sugar typically contains somewhere around 3 to 3.5% molasses by weight. Dark brown sugar climbs to around 6 to 6.5%. The difference in that small percentage accounts for the richer, more intense flavor and the deeper color of dark brown sugar compared to its lighter counterpart. Now we arrive at the question that brings most people to this topic in the first place. Is brown sugar actually better for you? And the honest answer, backed by nutritional data, is that the difference is genuinely negligible for the quantities most people consume. It is true that molasses contains trace amounts of minerals. Calcium, iron, potassium, and magnesium are all present in molasses in measurable quantities. This is real and not disputed. The problem is the scale. The amount of molasses in a standard serving of brown sugar, roughly 1 teaspoon, is so small that the mineral contribution it provides is nutritionally insignificant. We are talking about quantities that represent well under 1% of your recommended daily intake for any of those minerals. To obtain a meaningful amount of iron from brown sugar alone, for example, you would need to consume quantities so large that the sugar itself would cause far more harm than the iron could possibly offset. A teaspoon of white sugar contains approximately 16 calories. A teaspoon of brown sugar contains approximately 17. The bodies of both are digested and metabolized in essentially the same way. The glycemic response is virtually identical. Neither one is a health food, and neither one is dramatically worse than the other. They are, by every practical nutritional measure, the same ingredient with a modest cosmetic and culinary difference. None of this means that brown sugar and white sugar are interchangeable in the kitchen, because they are most certainly not. And the reason comes down to one key property of molasses: moisture retention. Molasses is hygroscopic, which is the technical way of saying it actively attracts and holds onto water molecules from the surrounding environment. This has real, measurable consequences when you bake with it. Cookies made with brown sugar tend to come out softer and chewier, because the molasses is pulling moisture in and preventing the baked good from drying out too quickly. They also spread slightly less during baking, resulting in a thicker cookie that stays tender longer after cooling. White sugar, being dry and free of molasses, behaves differently. It dissolves more cleanly, spreads more readily, and produces baked goods with a crisper, lighter finish. Think of the difference between a soft, dense chocolate chip cookie and a thin, crispy snickerdoodle. That textural contrast is largely driven by the type of sugar used. Molasses also carries its own flavor chemistry. It contains compounds that develop into rich, slightly bitter, caramel-adjacent notes during baking, particularly when exposed to heat. This is why gingerbread, barbecue sauce, and dark bran muffins almost always call for dark brown sugar specifically. The depth of flavor that molasses contributes is not just a subtle background note. In those recipes, it is the backbone of the entire flavor profile. So the choice between white and brown sugar in a recipe is not about health, and it is not about tradition. It is about texture, moisture, and flavor chemistry. Each has a role where it genuinely performs better than the other. Two bags sitting side by side on the same shelf. Made from the same plant. Refined through the same process. And in many cases, literally the same product. with one simply having its molasses removed and then reintroduced. The health gap between them is almost too small to measure. The flavor gap, however, is real, and it matters every time you pull a tray of cookies out of the oven. Sugar has spent centuries carrying the weight of cultural meaning, from a symbol of aristocratic wealth in medieval Europe to a villain in modern nutrition conversations. But perhaps the most interesting truth about sugar is simply this. Even something as ordinary as a baking ingredient can hide a surprisingly complex story behind a very simple label. If this one caught you off guard, share it with someone who still reaches for the brown bag thinking they are making the healthier choice. And if you want more stories hiding in plain sight, you know where to find them.